Okay, so we have recently created a new legal entity, the Banff Foundation for Allograft Pathology, as the structure behind the transplant pathology consensus-generating meetings that I organize every 2 years and have done since 1991. So there's a long, hairy presentation about that. And toward the end, we get to something that might actually interest you, which is what is the future of transplantation and transplant pathology. And one of the attributes of this new foundation is that we sort of buy into what we're doing in this course and the idea that one should try to make one's activities relevant to the future. So we incorporate ideas of where transplantation and transplantation pathology is going into the planning of the Banff Foundation. Now, of course, you're all familiar with Moore's Law, and we talk about it a lot in this course about the exponential change in price performance of computing. And this is what then ultimately leads us to predict that there will be a technological singularity in 2045 and machines will be smarter than we are and so on and so forth. You've heard that many times. So that's Moore's Law. If you spell Moore's Law backwards, you get Eroom's Law. And Eroom's Law is exactly the opposite. Rather than something increasing very rapidly, it's something that's going down very rapidly, and you can see it at this bottom right of this slide. It's the exponential decline in the number of newly approved drugs by the Food and Drug Administration or Health Protection Canada compared to $1 billion in R&D expenditure in the pharma area. And it's suddenly become almost impossible to afford to do the R&D to create a new drug that will be successfully approved and released. And so this is kind of the opposite. On the one hand, we have this exponential change with a lot of exciting things happening on the technology side. But on the regulatory side, we've almost ground to a halt where no company can afford to put the money into a new drug that would allow it to actually be studied and approved at the end. So what does that mean? Well, we've talked a lot about disruptive innovation in this course. For instance, if you take the inkjet printer, when the first inkjet printer was produced, it was inferior to the laser printer in every way. It was slower, the images weren't quite as sharp, everything you can imagine that had been a standard for the laser printer, it was inferior. But it was cheaper and it was mass producible, so like everybody on the planet could have an inkjet printer, and so now it is the standard. Most of you have your own personal inkjet printer. Previously, to own your own printer was like unthinkable, you know. Printers were centralized and very expensive and met certain standards. So that's disruptive innovation. There are many examples of that where you change the rules. You change the rules, you create something that follows a whole new set of rules and consumer behavior changes. So you can imagine that the behavior of the FDA and Health Protection Canada is going to change in some dramatic way, because how can you have a regulatory agency that just stops things so that medicine can't go forward because there can be no newly approved drugs? Something has to happen. But it's a rather complicated thing, isn't it? if you think of what's preventing you from regularly harming yourself with unapproved therapies, with like completely bogus remedies, like there used to be. You remember those pictures of bottles of snake oil and other things from like the 1800s? So it used to be possible for any company to make any claim about their therapy and to sell it, and it was a matter of being a good confidence man selling your product. And if you get people to buy it, there was a business in it, regardless of whether it was worthless, it did nothing, or actually did harm. A lot of these things did harm. So what prevents you from being damaged by these bogus therapies? It's the FDA and Health Protection Canada. And you actually want that. I mean, you may think that your life would be better if there were all these newly released drugs, but actually it's good for you that you are protected in this way. So I just want you to think of that as the background then. So the Banff Foundation for Allograft Pathology must remain youthful and relevant for the future, must adapt and plan for changes. As the field changes and stem cell grown organs replace transplantation, then the organization must change with it. There are a lot of theories about what's going to happen in transplantation, and one of them is kind of amusing, is the idea of losing its luster. Right now, if you're a transplant surgeon, that's a highly respected profession. And surgeons talk about how they walk with a special sort of bounce in their steps so you can tell what cool people they are. And it's just really fun to be part of that group. So you can imagine, and this is what these articles talk about, luster being lost. Where that bounce in the step is lost a little bit, they start to look not very different from other human beings. And in fact, fewer of the best and brightest young people go into that field. And that seems to be starting to happen now. We don't know all the reasons, but there are fewer people seeking training in transplantation than there used to be. There's less commercial money going into the field. Okay, so our organization needs more young people and women, needs enhanced cooperation with other organizations. And there's the idea of my alter ego that you may have heard about before. So David Crippen is comparable to me in that he runs email discussion groups in critical care medicine like I do in renal medicine, but we're about as different as any two people could possibly be. He has several motorcycles. He's lived sort of on the edge. He went to Nepal and stole some religious icons. You know, I mean, we've done similar things, but it's turned out differently. Brought back things that were never supposed to leave the country in his underwear. He was drafted and his girlfriend looked him in the eye, told him he was a loser, he got bad grades, he had terrible references. He's the type of person no medical school would ever take. But the University of Georgia, a powerful person there, thought, well, what's the worst that could happen if just once we dipped down and took somebody whose grades and references are lousy, but he seems to have a certain something, and we think he might make a good doctor anyway. So they took him, and so he's never won any civilian awards. I've won lots of civilian awards. He won lots of awards for bravery when he was in the military in Vietnam. We're about as different. He has his own rock band. I don't. So we have made a big deal of this alter ego-ness. He probably had more fun in the 60s and 70s than I did, because he did a lot of illegal stuff, and he's aging faster than I am. So we're trying to sort of get people to wrap their head around how the field will change, they're very resistant to this idea of not transplanting organs into anybody for anything in the future, and stem cell creation of organs replacing that. And so we try to get through this resistance by having them shift their mind to think about me and David Crippen and how things would be different. It was David Crippen speaking to you, David Crippen running this course, so on. And that we need to consider changes as different as that when visioning the future of transplantation. Now, the spectacular dynamics influencing the pace of stem cell generation, replacing transplantation in the future, this is one of the most intellectually challenging kind of conundrums or puzzles or formulas you're ever going to have to consider. Think of the background that I've given you here. You know, the FDA is ripe for disruptive innovation. Something's going to happen that's going to be a big change. And there's this Eroom's law, which I just told you about, that suggests that. However, maybe stem cells are the last area that they will give up, the last area where they will loosen the regulatory power that they have, because it's the area where more people and higher profile people are being harmed by bogus therapies right now than any other. Whichever is your favorite celebrity, the chances are about 50% that that person who, like you, really like to follow has gone off to Mexico or China or somewhere to get stem cell therapy for something, your favorite sports figures, and it's come back and reported a miraculous cure, you know, without any scientific data. So there are no medical articles supporting what these celebrity stories are telling you. And that is just the most ridiculous, unfixable situation. People are so oriented around the lives of famous people that when a famous person does something, doesn't matter if it has no basis in scientific fact, it influences a huge number of people. So they figure if their favorite sports star got stem cell therapy to fix his arm or leg or something, they want to do the same thing. So there's more and more of the stem cell tourism, and people are really being harmed physically and financially by this. It's probably this stem cell tourism now is the biggest area where the FDA and Health Protection Canada are standing in the way of many more people being harmed. And so I think there might be a simple argument that stem cells are stem cells, and they might loosen regulations in almost every other area so that some drugs get through the pipeline without spending hundreds of billions of dollars on them. But maybe stem cells won't be the area. But we're facing a really curious situation. By about 2020, the science will be there to create human organs from stem cells. And then how long will it take for the regulatory side to catch up? It could be 20, 30 years. I honestly don't know. It's such a mess now. And so it's hard. If we're just one parameter, when will the science be ready? It's possible to predict that. But there are just too many variables, too many unknowns here to really know. So we can be confident that medicine will change in this way, that there'll come a time when transplantation as we know it now will cease. That doesn't mean that what transplant surgeons and transplant physicians and transplant pathologists do will be worthless, because stem cell created organs, you might say that your assumption would be they'd be completely normal. But actually, if you think of, normal embryogenesis versus creating something in an artificial way. There are lots of things that can happen so that certain components are left out. For instance, in the kidney, commonly stem cell created kidneys are missing the loop of Henle. Well, without the loop of Henle, you can't concentrate the urine. So if I put an otherwise normal kidney into you that's missing loops of Henle, you'd pee out all your body water in an hour and be dead, right? That wouldn't be a good thing, even though the kidney would otherwise function perfectly. So there are many potential abnormal changes that could still exist in stem cell created organs. So we still need people to look into that, and there'll still be a role for some of the current skills. Anyway, that is basically what I wanted to tell you about, because I think it's a logical expectation that you would learn about stem cells in this course, and you probably, one way or the other, are learning about them. But I think it's really hard to come to one conclusion at the moment. It's really hard to predict what will happen. But if you check on the science, there's new stuff happening almost every week. In animal species, there are more different organs that are becoming possible to create from stem cells in animals. All the barriers to doing this in people seem to be falling rather rapidly, and so we're hurtling toward a future where there'd be no shortage of organs at all. And a lot of organs we don't transplant today. You could have any organ. If there's an organ you need, you can have it. There would be no shortage, and it would be very different from the medicine of today. So that's what I wanted to tell you about. Any questions about that?
Well, the ethical issues regarding stem cells, I know a lot of people have problems with sourcing it or, where it might be coming from.
So the ethical issues around embryonic stem cells are obvious because it relates to aborted fetuses. That is the main origin. But more and more there are adult stem cells that you can obtain in other ways that you can reprogram, so they become pluripotent, just like the embryonic ones. So yes, it's a problem, but it's not much of a barrier at the moment to stem cell things in general, because I'm not recommending that you do this, but if you go on celebrity sites and do like sports figures, stem cells, you'll get hundreds of hits, all different people, or Hollywood celebrities, stem cells. So it's a very active thing now, and you're right that there are ethical barriers, but I think they'll be rapidly overcome, and in a way that satisfies people with almost all religious backgrounds.
So I was wondering if we can make a kidney out of stem cells, and if those ones being made from stem cells just happen to be missing this loop of Henle, why can't we use stem cells to make a loop of Henle?
No, I think made properly, stem cells create kidneys that have loops of Henle. It has to do with cell density and the dynamics and stuff like that. And if you're saying, why couldn't you take a kidney lacking loops of Henle and insert stem cells and have that? Well, once the rest of the kidney's made, the tubular system would be completely connected. There's no space left for the loops of Henle that should be there. Yes?
I'm just going to ask, how these stem cell made organs are actually made? Because I'm not that familiar with the literature that's out there these days with new ways of making organs. When you talk about the loop of Henle being missing from these organs, like what are the ways in general these organs are made from stem cells?
So you decellularize the organ. So say you take a heart that's got muscle cells and fibrous tissue and endothelium, blood vessels in it. You remove all the cells so that the fibrous structure is left. And then you repopulate that now completely white, I mean, a beautiful ghost-like representation of a heart. But it's missing all the muscle cells and everything. It just has the sort of background structure. And then you put stem cells in there and they proliferate and they sense from where they end up what they should turn into. So it sounds like magic. The magic doesn't work perfectly. Right now in stem cell grown hearts, they seem to have all the right cells in all the right places, but they don't beat as hard and as vigorously as a normal heart. And we don't really know why. I'm sure it's a fixable problem, but it's really interesting that you get it. So it looks perfect. Everything's there, but it's sort of, it's like a heart that doesn't have the proper muscular tone or something, but otherwise. Yeah, so that's how it works. You take a structure, remove all its cells, and then put in new cells, and they repopulate. And they can be your own stem cells, so it's genetically identical to you, so it will not reject.
I have another question. Say our work with stem cells somehow fails, that we can't make these perfect organs that we can transplant in the future. Do you feel as a pathologist there's any future for, say, artificially made organs? I say the mechanical heart, mechanical pancreas with the enzymes required to make insulin, like something in more of a technological route in that sense?
Well, I think the unknowns about what the body does continue to sort of confound that. Do we know everything that the kidney does, and do we know how to make a machine that does everything? Generally, that hasn't been the approach. There's something called the BioArtificial Kidney. We combine sort of a dialysis membrane and then a layer of growing tubular cells in kind of a monolayer. So it combines the pure technology side with biology. That has generally been the approach because it's so hard to figure out all the functions that you need to replace and exactly how you would do that, whereas the cells already know. So it's simpler to put in cells that already know what to do, rather than relying on designing, a machine to carry out every function that the normal kidney carries out. That's just a harder challenge. It's not impossible. I can tell you a funny story. So the BioArtificial Kidney, the first guy to give a lecture about this, it was at a plenary session at a big kidney meeting, thousands of people there in the largest room. And it was clear what this was about. It was about, as you say, an artificial kidney with the combining sort of growing cells with the dialysis membrane to replace all functions of the kidney. And there's no other competing session, but as it got closer to the time for this guy to speak, everybody seemed to be looking at their watch and deciding they needed to leave the room. when he actually spoke, I was just about the only person there. It shows you sometimes the resistance to new ideas, particularly when you're in a for-profit circumstance where you benefit from things staying the way they are. And you really don't want to hear about some new thing that's going to upturn the apple cart so that your whole financial source of being is just, not predictable anymore. So I asked him what he thought happened. He said, they're not ready. I'm ready, but they're not ready. Yeah.
I was wondering, how does one test the integrity of stem cell organ once it's made? I'm assuming you don't just put it in the patient and wait to see what happens.
No, I think it would be similar to now, but it would be a fascinating challenge. A biopsy now, like when I look at a piece of kidney from a transplanted organ, I'm looking for diseases and I'm looking for rejection. I'm not looking for the idea that it's pretty normal but there's something missing. But I think that's what we will have a whole new category of thing that a transplant or, that a solid organ pathologist needs to look for, and that is everything there? Are all the parts of the organ present? Is it normally structured? So I would imagine that there'll be a period of time at least where we will be taking small pieces of these stem cell grown organs and examining them under the microscope to make sure everything's there that would cause them to function normally. You could also do functional tests to some extent. Before you put them in, you can look at, the urine coming out from the ureter and that sort of. There are various tests that you could imagine doing. So you could combine looking at structure and looking at function so that you don't go through an operation and just make everything worse for the patient by putting in an organ that does all the wrong things. Yeah. So any other questions? Yeah.
Yeah, I'm just curious if you have any idea of which organs we won't be able to treat with stem cell replacements, or what are the limits, basically, of this type of.
Well, I think let's think about disseminated diseases of the nervous system, for instance, diseases that affect every nerve in all parts of the body. I guess stem cells by themselves wouldn't necessarily fix things. But you could imagine that some sort of nanobot, not the nanobots of today, but the nanobots like those fictional nanobots that can do all sorts of amazing things, that could home to nerves and specifically give these abnormal nerves what they need somehow. So I think that might be one of the most challenging things, is truly systemic diseases like that, sort of fixing everything in all parts of the body. That's a lot harder than a single organ which has failed. But I still think it's possible. And then what about aging itself, and fixing the skin and that sort of thing, fixing the hair. So I think all that is possible ultimately. It's not stem cells necessarily that will do that. It's sort of genetic reprogramming, I guess. More of the kind of thing that David Pierce is talking about. I don't think there's any medical condition that we would want to change that is not potentially treatable by these therapies in the future. So, any other questions? wow, I thought there was like totally fail, but this is as good as a lecture that I had prepared, maybe, yeah. No, I think it's simple, really, that this is just a temporary problem. Maybe it is what you get when you create an organ like the heart, where there's no pressure inside as you're creating it, so it doesn't have any work to do until you're finished. Whereas in the normal situation, the heart starts to beat in the first few days of life, and as it grows, it's always doing its thing. There's always pressure inside, and it has work to do. So I think that's probably all it would take. You need to create a heart in a situation where, while it's being created, it's actually working, it's actually doing stuff. There's actually pressure inside the heart chambers, all the things that exist in life. And then I think you would probably get a heart that's vigorous and able to do everything that a regular heart would be able to do. So yeah, I mean, such a heart would be prone to heart failure and just wouldn't lead to a very fun life, because every time you wanted to do anything to exert yourself, you'd get like really tired. So yeah, but I'm sure it's fixable. Really, every problem we have with stem cell generated organs at the moment, you can imagine that those problems will be fixed in the next few years. So we're very close to a point where, if we could overcome the regulatory barriers, we could routinely use stem cell generated organs.
I have a question about how long these stem cell generated organs can last. Do they have the potential for sort of being functional as long as a normal, well-functioning organ? Because I know with some techniques like cloning, the clones that come out from animals usually show signs of advanced aging in their organs.
Yeah. I don't know if the rates of telomere shortening has been studied. So I mean, that's one aspect of whether these would have a normal lifespan. I don't know that for sure, but that would be a fixable problem too. It's just another a parameter. If you find out that the telomeres are shortening abnormally fast, then you just need to figure out how to change that. It's not a permanent problem. Everything's fixable, I think. So, yeah.
And you talked a bit about the FDA regulations, how they're getting tighter. Do you have any idea of what kind of corporate interests are lobbying for some of the... Are there any corporate interests lobbying for tighter regulations? Because you mentioned the for-profit sector benefiting from the current technologies and the lack of change. I was wondering if there's been any news of just corporate tampering in FDA operations.
Well, I guess I have sort of a skewed view of it, because the corporate investment in the field that I'm in has been consistently going down, like the last 10 years, and big pharma companies like Roche, for instance, are basically getting out of that area. Roche is no longer a player in the transplantation field. I think it's a problem that goes beyond corporate lobbying, because corporations, particularly pharmaceutical corporations, now have a bit of a PR problem. You would be aware of that. So if the only entity arguing that the FDA needs to change was big pharma, I don't think anything would change, because people sort of have various conspiracy theories about big pharma being the bad guy. But I think a lot of ordinary people, and a lot of people with orphan diseases that affect very small numbers of people, they also feel that something needs to change. There needs to be a way to get drugs to the market without these extraordinary costs and long time periods and many, many failures of drugs where you spend years and years and then it's not, approved at the end. So I think lobbying by ordinary people will have an effect, and that's probably, if you think of the thing that caused the inkjet printer to come out ahead of the laser printer, it wasn't, corporations, it was people like you who went out and bought the inkjet printer and said, this is just fine, This may not be quite as sharp as the laser jet, but I like it, so, yeah.
Oh, speaking of the laser jet, that leads into my next question. In terms of these stem cell organs, what is the accessibility like for this type of treatment? Because as we know, with all new treatments, there's usually barriers from government providing the care to the patients who need it. It takes a long time to approve it.
I think we don't know, but everything we've talked about in this course would conceivably apply. Elitism, the idea that new technologies benefit only the rich or only people in rich countries, and then speciesism, right? I mean, is this only going to benefit human beings? What about sentient higher animals? Should we do the same for elephants, horses, and then pets and so on? Where does it end? I can't really answer that, but you can imagine all sorts of scenarios. For instance, a particularly plausible one would be that it's widely accessible to people in developed countries, and it's accessible to very rich people for their pets and everything else. That if they're able to pay, they can get organs for the dogs and cats and everything else. Yeah. So that's sort of what I think. But we need the Earl Wahs of the world to be raising these ethical issues. They're always there, and you can imagine things that make life and health a lot better for us could actually make illness much harder to bear in the poorest countries of the world. So, it's kind of good always. I think Bibiana Kujak is talking about that this coming week. So it would be nice to think that technology advances health for everybody, not just people in wealthy countries. Any other questions? Okay, so thank you. I'm sorry that Jack didn't come, but so the deal was, it's kind of interesting. So we did peer review with the top 5 lectures last term and got people to tell us what they recommended, because you can get sort of stuck if you're very proud of what you're doing and you enter into all this sort of self-praising stuff and you never get any better. So we thought by going outside we would get ideas of ways to further improve even the best parts of the course. And the peer reviewers said that they thought Jack's lecture was trying to pack too much into one lecture, so we'd make it into 2. So that had been the idea, but now you see it's going to be packed back into 1 again. So life has all these funny twists and turns. So maybe it will be 2 lectures next term, but I don't think it'll be 2 lectures this term because of what happened today. Okay, well, thank you very much for putting up with the unpredictability and surprises that were part of today. So we have 6 people for rich man, poor man. There's still 4 seats out there for remaining students if you are interested, and your friends. Okay, thank you very much. That's it for today.